November 1883, Eastern Montana Territory. Everyone laughed at the cabin long before winter arrived. They laughed when they rode past it on horseback and saw only a low hump of earth where a proper home should have stood. They laughed when they noticed the roof barely rising above the ground, when they saw grass growing on top instead of shingles, when they realized most of the structure was buried rather than displayed. To them, a house was supposed to rise proudly into the air, standing tall against the horizon as proof that a man could tame the land. This thing did the opposite. It disappeared into the ground. It looked like hiding. It looked like fear. And fear, in their minds, was worse than death on the frontier. Everyone laughed at the cabin long before winter arrived. They laughed when they rode past it on horseback and saw only a low hump of earth where a proper home should have stood. They laughed when they noticed the roof barely rising above the ground, when they saw grass growing on top instead of shingles, when they realized most of the structure was buried rather than displayed. To them, a house was supposed to rise proudly into the air, standing tall against the horizon as proof that a man could tame the land. This thing did the opposite. It disappeared into the ground. It looked like hiding. It looked like fear. And fear, in their minds, was worse than death on the frontier. The men who built it heard the laughter but did not answer it. His name was Caleb Morrison, and he was not known as a troublemaker or a dreamer. He was quiet, observant, and careful with his words. He had come west like so many others, believing that hard work and determination would be enough. But he had also learned something important in his first winters on the plains. Effort alone did not keep people alive. The land did not reward pride. It rewarded understanding. Eastern Montana winters were unforgiving. The cold did not arrive gently. It came suddenly, violently, and without mercy. Wind raced across the open plains with nothing to slow it down, tearing heat from anything foolish enough to stand exposed. Trees were scarce, which meant firewood was precious. Every log burned for warmth was a log that had taken hours to cut, split, and haul. Men worked themselves to exhaustion just to feed fires that never seemed satisfied. Women slept lightly, waking again and again to add wood before the flames died. Children learned early that winter was not just a season. It was a threat. Most settlers built their cabins the way they had always been built back east. Raised wooden floors rested above the ground to prevent rot. Log walls stood upright and exposed on all sides. Roofs were pitched steeply to shed snow. These cabins looked strong. They looked familiar. They looked correct. But they were poorly suited for a place where wind never stopped and cold pressed in from every direction at once. Air moved freely beneath the floors, carrying away heat faster than any fire could replace it. The walls, though thick, slowly surrendered warmth to the brutal temperatures outside. Even the fireplaces worked against the people they were meant to protect, pulling heated air up the chimney as quickly as it was created. Caleb watched families suffer through winters that left them hollow-eyed and desperate. He saw neighbors abandon their claims not because they lacked courage, but because their homes failed them. He noticed frost forming on the inside of cabin walls. He noticed ice creeping across floors. He noticed how much would disappear just to keep temperatures barely above freezing. And he noticed something else too, something quieter, something that most people ignored. The ground never froze the same way the air did. Caleb noticed that root cellars stayed usable even in the worst cold. He noticed that dugouts and earth shelters, often dismissed as temporary or primitive, stayed calm and steady inside. He heard stories of indigenous earth lodges that remained livable through generations of winters far worse than anything the settlers had yet experienced. He paid attention when others dismissed those observations as irrelevant or uncivilized. Instead of arguing, he measured. He borrowed a thermometer and pushed it into the soil. 2 feet down, the temperature barely changed. 4 feet down, it was still warm. 6 feet down, it hardly moved at all, no matter what the weather did above. While the air swung wildly from warm afternoons to deadly nights, the earth remained patient and steady. It absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. It did not panic. It did not forget. That was when Caleb made his decision. He would not fight winter the way everyone else did. He would avoid it. When he began digging into a south-facing hillside instead of stacking logs, the criticism started immediately. People told him he was wasting time. They said the roof would collapse under snow. They warned him about moisture, mold, sickness, and death. They mocked him openly, calling his project a grave, a burrow, a hole fit for animals but not men. His wife heard the whispers. His children heard the jokes. Even suppliers charged him more, assuming anyone foolish enough to dig a house into the ground wouldn't notice unfair prices. Caleb kept digging. He cut the trench carefully, shaping the walls straight and firm. The back and side walls pressed directly into the earth, while the front remained low and partially exposed to catch winter sunlight. He placed the entrance so cold air would settle below the living space instead of rushing inside. He covered the roof with layers of poles, branches, and thick sod, creating a heavy blanket of earth above his head. He installed a small iron stove rather than a large open fireplace, choosing efficiency over appearance. Everything had a reason. Nothing was wasted. By the time winter arrived, the cabin looked finished but unimpressive. It did not stand out. It did not announce itself. It waited. When the blizzard came, it came with fury. The temperature plunged below zero and stayed there. Wind screamed across the plains for days, driving snow so hard it cut exposed skin. Visibility vanished. Doors disappeared behind drifts. Livestock froze where they stood. Inside traditional cabins, chaos ruled. Fires had to be fed constantly. Wood piles shrank at terrifying speed. Floors froze solid. Water turned to ice even beside roaring hearths. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, praying the fire would not die before morning. And through it all, Caleb's cabin remained calm. Inside, the temperature stayed steady. Warm air did not rush out when the door opened because cold air settled in the lower entryway. Heat did not vanish through walls because earth surrounded them on 3 sides. The sod roof absorbed warmth and released it slowly, hour after hour. The stove burned clean and efficient, needing attention only a few times a day. Children played on the floor. His wife worked by candlelight. Life continued. When a neighbor finally staggered through the storm to Caleb's door, desperate and half-frozen, the warmth inside shocked him. A thermometer on the wall read 68 degrees. Outside, the storm raged at nearly 20 below. The difference was not small. It was enormous. 55 degrees separated suffering from comfort, danger from safety, desperation from control. Word spread quickly. After the storm broke, the laughter stopped. People came quietly, not to mock but to ask. How deep had he dug? Which direction did the cabin face? How thick was the roof? How much wood did it really use? Caleb answered calmly, without pride. He let the results speak. In the years that followed, the valley changed. More homes sank into hillsides. Earth berms appeared against cabin walls. Ceilings lowered. Wood piles lasted longer. Winters grew more manageable. The idea once called foolish became common sense. Caleb Morrison did not change the land. He listened to it. He did not defeat winter. He stepped aside and let physics do the work. The cabin they mocked was not brave in the way people expected bravery to look. It did not stand tall. It endured quietly. And when winter delivered its judgment, it was the warmest home in the blizzard. After the blizzard passed and the wind finally loosened its grip on the land, the valley did not return to normal. Snow still lay deep in drifts, fences remained buried, and livestock losses were counted in quiet voices, but something else had changed beneath the surface. People spoke differently now. They no longer joked when they rode past the low earthen cabin. They slowed their horses. They looked. Some dismounted and walked around it in silence, pressing their boots into the packed snow, studying the way the ground rose gently around the walls as if the land itself had decided to protect what was beneath it. They noticed the lack of ice around the doorway, the absence of frantic smoke from the chimney, the simple fact that life inside had continued without panic while others had nearly broken under the strain. Inside the traditional cabins, the storm had left marks that could not be ignored. Floorboards warped and split from freezing and thawing. Chinking had cracked and fallen away. Furniture burned for fuel left empty corners and bitter memories. Woodpiles that were meant to last the entire winter were gone in days, forcing men to venture out too soon into dangerous conditions to cut more. The cost of survival had been paid in exhaustion, fear, and loss. And once people had seen another way, once they had felt warmth where they expected misery, they could not forget it. Men who had once spoken the loudest against the trench cabin now spoke the least. They did not apologize, but they asked questions in careful tones, as if afraid the ground itself might hear them. They wanted to know how deep the walls were, how water was kept out, whether the roof truly held under heavy snow. They wanted to know if the warmth was real or some trick of timing. Caleb answered patiently, explaining that the earth itself carried the load, that snow only added insulation, that water followed paths you could predict if you watched long enough. He did not speak like a teacher. He spoke like someone describing the weather, calm and certain. Women noticed changes too. They noticed that Caleb's children did not cough through the night the way others did. They noticed that his wife's hands were not cracked and bleeding from endless fire tending. They noticed that laundry dried inside without freezing stiff, that meals were cooked without coats still on. These details mattered. Comfort was not laziness. It was survival without constant damage. By late winter, a few men began testing the idea quietly. They dug shallow pits near their cabins to see how warm the soil stayed. They paid attention to where snow melted first in spring. They watched how water moved during thaw. These were not builders by trade, but winter had taught them something carpentry alone could not. Strength did not come from standing taller than the storm. It came from standing where the storm could not reach you. When spring finally arrived, it arrived slowly, as it always did. The snow receded in patches. Mud replaced ice. The land exhaled. And with that thaw came decisions. Families who had nearly frozen did not want to test their luck again. They talked openly now about changing their homes. Not all of them were ready to dig fully into the earth, but many began with smaller changes. Earth was piled against north-facing walls. Sleeping areas were lowered. Entrances were reworked to stop wind from rushing inside. The idea spread not because it was fashionable, but because it worked. New settlers arriving that year noticed something different. They expected rows of raised log cabins like the ones they had left behind. Instead, They saw homes tucked into hillsides, roofs that blended into the ground, chimneys rising from places that barely looked like buildings at all. At first, they thought they had arrived somewhere unfinished, somewhere temporary. Then winter came, and they understood over time, the trench cabin stopped being a curiosity and became a reference point. When someone planned a new build, the question was no longer whether to use earth, but how much. Builders began adapting their skills, learning how to frame roofs that carried soil, how to manage drainage properly, how to balance light and warmth. The land office stopped questioning improvement claims that included earth-sheltered structures. Survival had validated them. Caleb Morrison did not grow rich from his idea. He did not patent it or sell plans. People came to him for advice, and he gave it freely. He walked properties with neighbors, pointing out subtle slopes, explaining how to read the ground after rain, showing where frost lingered longest. He spoke with respect for the land, not as something to conquer, but as something to cooperate with. Those who listened fared better. Those who refused eventually changed their minds or moved on. Children who grew up in earth-sheltered homes carried the memory of steady warmth into adulthood. They remembered winters not as endless fear, but as seasons that could be endured. This shaped how they built, how they planned, how they judged strength. The old idea that a man proved himself by standing exposed began to fade. A new idea took its place. Wisdom was knowing when not to stand in the wind at all. Years passed. Storms came and went. Some were mild. Some were brutal. But the outcomes were predictable now. Homes that worked with the land remained stable. Those that fought it paid the price. The lesson repeated itself until it no longer needed to be spoken aloud. By the late 1880s, earth-sheltered construction was no longer mocked in eastern Montana. It was discussed in practical terms, mentioned in newspapers without comment, passed along as advice to newcomers. What had once been called a grave was now understood as shelter in its most honest form. The earth did not care about pride. It cared about balance. Caleb grew older, his hair graying, his movements slower, but his home remained much the same. The sod roof was repaired when needed. The drainage cleared after heavy rains. The walls stood firm. The cabin did not demand constant rebuilding. It did not decay the way exposed wood did. It aged quietly, like the land around it. When Caleb eventually fell ill, it was not from cold or damp, as critics had once predicted. It was from pneumonia, a common fate in those years, unrelated to where or how he lived. When he died, his passing was marked simply. There were no speeches about innovation or bravery. But men who had once laughed stood quietly at his burial. They knew what they owed their survival to, even if they never said it out loud. Long after Caleb was gone, the cabin remained. Other families lived in it. Children were born there. Winters passed without incident. When it was finally abandoned decades later, it was not because it had failed, but because times had changed. Better materials were available. Roads improved. New methods emerged. Still, when people looked at the old earthen walls, they saw no rot, no collapse, no evidence of weakness. They saw proof the cabin they mocked had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had kept a family warm when warmth meant life. It had proven that survival was not about stubbornness, but about understanding. And it left behind a lesson that outlasted ridicule, storms, and even the men who built it. Winter never changed. The wind never softened. But people did. And all because one man chose to dig into the earth and trust what it remembered. As years passed, the memory of that first blizzard did not fade the way people expected it to. Storms came and went, some fierce, some mild, but none erased what had been learned. Every winter afterward was compared to that one, and every time the comparison was made, the same truth surfaced. The homes that worked with the land endured calmly. The homes that stood exposed suffered again and again. This realization slowly changed how people thought about building, but more importantly, it changed how they thought about strength. Strength was no longer loud. It was no longer tall. It was quiet, efficient, and prepared. Children who had grown up in earth-sheltered homes carried those lessons into adulthood without realizing it. They remembered winters where they could sit at a table without gloves, where their breath did not fog the air indoors, where nights were not interrupted by the constant fear of a dying fire. When they left to start families of their own, they carried that memory with them. Even if they did not build full trench cabins, they built smarter. They lowered ceilings. They protected walls from wind. They paid attention to slope, sun, and soil. The land itself had become part of their thinking. New settlers arriving from the east often brought old habits with them. They arrived with plans for raised cabins and wide porches, believing they could outwork the winter the same way others had tried before them. Some learned quickly. Others learned the hard way. But now there were people willing to warn them. Not with lectures, but with stories. Stories of a cabin once mocked. Stories of a blizzard that settled all arguments. Stories backed not by theory, but by survival. Over time, local builders adapted their craft. Carpenters learned how to frame roofs meant to carry earth. Stonemasons learned how to manage drainage more carefully. Even suppliers began stocking materials suited for underground and semi-buried structures. What had once been treated as a strange exception slowly became part of standard practice. No one announced this change. It happened quietly, one decision at a time, driven by memory and experience. The land itself seemed to reward those choices. Homes tucked into hillsides suffered less damage from storms. Livestock shelters built with earth berms kept animals alive through cold snaps that would have killed them in open barns. Root cellars expanded into living spaces. Storage areas became sleeping rooms during the coldest months. Efficiency replaced excess. Waste became rare. People learned that burning less wood did not mean living smaller lives. It meant living safer ones. Caleb Morrison's name slowly became part of local history, mentioned without ceremony but with respect. People referred to his cabin the way one refers to a landmark, not because it was grand, but because it marked a turning point. Older men would nod when it was mentioned. Younger ones listened. The lesson carried weight because it had been paid for in fear and cold, not comfort and hindsight. As decades passed and technology improved, some believed the old ways would become irrelevant. Better stoves appeared. New materials promised stronger walls and tighter seals. Roads improved, making fuel easier to transport. And yet, even with these advancements, the principles remained unchanged. Homes that ignored wind still lost heat. Structures that exposed too much surface area still struggled. Builders who paid attention to earth, mass, and shelter continued to outperform those who relied on appearance alone. By the turn of the century, earth-sheltered construction no longer seemed strange in eastern Montana. It simply existed. It was no longer talked about as a bold choice or a desperate one. It was just one of many sensible ways to live where winter ruled. What had once drawn laughter now drew no reaction at all, which was perhaps the greatest proof of its success. Caleb's original cabin, still standing quietly, witnessed these changes without comment. Its walls remained firm. Its roof held. Its interior stayed dry and stable. It required little maintenance compared to exposed wooden structures that needed constant repair. When new families lived there, they often remarked on how little effort it took to keep warm. They did not know the full story at first. They only knew that winter felt different inside those walls. Eventually, the cabin was abandoned, not because it failed, but because times had moved on. Larger homes were built. Towns expanded. New ideas replaced old ones. Still, when the structure was finally examined years later, it showed no sign of the decay that critics had once promised. The earth walls were intact. The drainage still worked. The design had aged better than many of the homes built after it. The lesson it left behind extended beyond architecture. It spoke to something deeper about human behavior. People often mistake tradition for wisdom. They assume that what has been done before must be right, even when the environment changes. Caleb Morrison had not rejected tradition out of defiance. He had questioned whether it still applied. That willingness to observe, measure, and adapt made the difference between hardship and stability. In later years, as discussions about self-sufficiency and off-grid living reappeared in new forms, the same principles surfaced again. Modern builders spoke of thermal mass, passive solar design, earth insulation, and energy efficiency. They used new words and new tools, but the ideas were old. The ground still remembered warmth. Wind still stole heat. Volume still mattered. Physics had not changed. Those who studied the past carefully saw that innovation was often rediscovery. Long before settlers arrived, indigenous peoples had already solved the problem of surviving harsh winters on the plains. Their earth lodges had used the same principles Caleb would later apply. What settlers called progress had sometimes meant forgetting lessons already learned. Caleb's cabin had quietly reminded people of that truth. The story endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. No hero stood atop a roof during the storm. No last-minute rescue saved the day. There was no miracle, only preparation. The cabin worked because it had been designed to work. It succeeded because it respected the land rather than challenged it. Winter never softened its stance. The wind never grew kinder. The cold never asked permission. But people learned how to respond differently. They learned that survival was not about proving toughness to others. It was about creating conditions where toughness was no longer constantly required. In the end, the cabin they mocked became something larger than a shelter. It became a reminder that results matter more than reputation, that quiet solutions often outperform loud ones, and that nature does not care how things look. It only cares how they function. And every winter after that, when the wind swept across the plains and snow buried the land once again, the earth held its warmth patiently beneath the surface, waiting for those wise enough to trust it.